biting wind was an old acquaintance to Elias Thorne, a solitary man whose life was etched into the weathered lines of his face, carved by years of sun and solitude. He moved through the skeletal remains of winter's grip on his vast, desolate ranch, the air sharp with the scent of pine and impending snow. His hands, gnarled and strong, carried the weight of burdens unseen, memories that clung to him like burrs to a wool coat, impossible to fully dislodge. Each creak of the old barn, each whisper of the wind through the tall, dry grass, seemed to echo a loneliness so profound it had become a physical presence, a constant companion in the stark silence that was his only solace. He had built walls of ice around his heart, impenetrable and cold, believing them to be his only protection against the world's relentless cruelty. Yet even through those formidable barriers, a phantom ache persisted, a dull throb that spoke of a life unlived, of connections severed, of a future that had long since curdled into a bitter past. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a distant, almost feral gleam, a wariness born of too many betrayals, too many losses. He had convinced himself that feeling nothing was the only way to survive, that indifference was a shield, not a prison. This ranch, stretching endlessly under the vast, indifferent sky, was both his refuge and his cage, a monument to a life deliberately stripped bare of all but the most essential, all but the raw struggle for existence. He had made peace with his isolation, or so he told himself, until a shadow, small and hesitant, detached itself from the encroaching dusk, stirring the dust in a way no wind ever could. It was a girl, impossibly thin, her form a testament to suffering, her movements awkward, uneven. She leaned heavily on a crude, splintered crutch, a tiny figure against the backdrop of the enormous, indifferent landscape. Her eyes, wide and luminous, met his, holding an ancient wisdom that belied her apparent youth. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken stories, before her voice, surprisingly clear despite its fragility, broke the spell, piercing the silence that had been Elias's sanctuary. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" she asked, the words hanging in the cold air, a stark, desperate plea that held no hint of shame, only an undeniable raw need. The question, simple yet devastating in its implications, shattered the fragile peace Elias had meticulously constructed, forcing him to confront a reality he had long sought to ignore. It was a question that demanded more than just a simple answer. It demanded a reckoning. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The rancher's gaze, initially a shield of detached indifference, sharpened, scrutinizing the girl with an intensity that might have withered a lesser soul. He saw the tattered clothes, far too thin for the biting autumn air, the dirt ingrained beneath her fingernails, the desperate flicker in her large, dark eyes. He noticed the way her right leg, twisted and withered, seemed to drag, a cruel burden she bore with a quiet, uncomplaining resignation. His first impulse, a reflex honed by years of self-preservation and a deep-seated distrust of the world beyond his fence line, was to turn her away, to send her back into the encroaching darkness from which she had emerged. This place was his, solitary and unforgiving, a sanctuary from the very kind of messy human need she embodied. He had nothing to give, nothing left to share. His pantry was stocked for one, his heart already hollowed out. Yet something in her gaze, a profound weariness mingled with an undeniable spark of life, held him. It wasn't a plea for pity, but a simple statement of survival, a desperate negotiation for the most basic of needs. He grunted, a sound more akin to a wounded animal than a human response, turning his back to her, deliberately focusing on the splintered wood of the barn door. The scent of hay and old leather filled the air, a familiar comfort against this unexpected intrusion. He felt the weight of her eyes on his back, a silent accusation, a persistent question mark in the vast canvas of his isolation. He half expected her to leave, to fade back into the desolate landscape like a wisp of smoke, but she remained, a tenacious shadow rooted to the spot, her crutch biting into the dry earth. The silence stretched, now imbued with a different kind of tension, an unspoken battle of wills between the hardened old man and the frail, persistent girl. He heard a faint tremor in her breath, perhaps a shiver from the cold, perhaps the faint echo of a sob suppressed, and a distant, almost forgotten chord vibrated deep within him. It was a faint, unsettling tremor, a ripple in the calm surface of his carefully constructed indifference. He clenched his jaw, the muscle ticking under his weathered skin, grappling with a flicker of something he had long buried, a semblance of obligation, a ghost of forgotten humanity. He had seen hunger before, in the eyes of stray dogs, in the gaunt faces of desperate men who sometimes wandered onto his land seeking work. But this was different. This was a child, a girl with a broken body, standing on the precipice of utter despair, her plea echoing the raw, unvarnished truth of existence. He turned slowly, his expression still unyielding, his voice a gravelly rumble. "What do you want here?" he asked, the words sharp, intended to cut, to drive her away. But even as he spoke them, he knew they lacked their usual conviction. The girl did not flinch, her gaze steady, unwavering, holding his. Her small shoulders, barely visible beneath the threadbare shawl, shivered once, a tremor that seemed to travel directly through Elias despite his formidable resolve. She swallowed, her throat a fragile column in her emaciated neck, and repeated her request, softer this time, almost a whisper against the roaring silence of the ranch. "Just leftovers, sir. Anything you can spare." Elias's eyes scanned the vast emptiness around them, the fading light bleeding across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and gray. There was nowhere for her to go, no other signs of life for miles around. This was not a place for a child, least of all a crippled one, to be wandering alone. A phantom sensation, cold and unsettling, brushed against his consciousness, the sharp, sudden memory of a small hand in his own, long, long ago. He pushed it back ruthlessly, like shoving a burning ember back into the ashes from which it threatened to reignite. He turned abruptly, walking towards the old farmhouse, his footsteps heavy on the frozen earth, the dry grass crunching under his boots. He did not invite her, did not offer a word of welcome, but neither did he forbid her. It was a silent, grudging concession, a threadbare mercy he barely understood himself. The girl, after a moment of hesitation that seemed to weigh an eternity, began to follow, her crutch thudding rhythmically against the ground, a slow, arduous procession. The sound grated on Elias's nerves, a constant reminder of her vulnerability, of the burden she carried, and by extension the burden he was now, however unwillingly, about to assume. Inside the dimly lit kitchen, the air was stale, imbued with the lingering scent of old coffee and dust. Elias moved with the practiced efficiency of a man long accustomed to his own company, pulling out a half-eaten loaf of bread, a sliver of dried meat, and a cold potato from last night's supper. He set them on the worn wooden table, not bothering with a plate, the gesture as stark and unadorned as the man himself. He didn't look at her as he did so, his gaze fixed on the cold, dark window pane, where his own distorted reflection stared back, a stranger in his own life. The girl approached the table, her eyes wide, like a fawn approaching water in a parched land. She picked up the bread, her fingers trembling slightly, and brought it to her lips, not devouring it ravenously, but with a quiet reverence, as if each crumb was a sacred offering. There was no sound but the quiet rustle of her movements, the faint gnawing of a mouse in the walls, and the distant mournful howl of the wind. This wasn't charity, Elias told himself. It was merely the pragmatic act of feeding a stray, an inconvenient necessity. Yet the sight of her, so fragile and so utterly alone, stirred a disquiet within him, a subtle tremor that hinted at the long-buried foundations of his own grief. It was the first crack in the ice, imperceptible to anyone but himself. As the girl ate, Elias watched her in the periphery of his vision, his gaze fixed elsewhere, yet acutely aware of every small movement she made. He noted the careful, almost methodical way she consumed the meager offering, as if savoring each bite, stretching its sustenance. There was no greed in her, only a profound gratitude that radiated from her small frame, a silent hymn of thanks that resonated in the quiet kitchen. This wasn't the frantic hunger of a wild animal, but the quiet, deep-seated need of someone who knew the true value of scarcity. It gnawed at something within him, a faint, insistent whisper of a past he meticulously kept locked away. His mind, unbidden, drifted back through the swirling fog of years to a different kitchen, brightly lit and filled with the scent of freshly baked bread. A small, sturdy wooden high chair, painted a cheerful blue, the clatter of tiny spoons against ceramic, the soft, contented gurgle of a child, his child. A daughter, with hair the color of warm honey and eyes that mirrored the hopeful blue of a summer sky. He saw her, as if through a dusty pane of glass, reaching out chubby fingers for a piece of buttered toast, her laughter a melody that had once filled the vast, echoing chambers of his heart. The memory, sharp and sudden, was like a shard of ice plunged into a festering wound, causing a sharp intake of breath he quickly stifled. He clenched his fists, the knuckles white, fighting the sudden, overwhelming tide of grief that threatened to drown him. He had buried that life, those memories, under layers of stone and silence, convinced that forgetting was the only path to survival. But this girl, with her quiet hunger and her fragile presence, was chipping away at his carefully constructed tomb, letting slivers of light, and with them, agonizing pain, seep back in. He remembered the last time he had seen that joy, that light in his daughter's eyes, before the fever, before the coughing fits racked her small body, before the silence descended, heavy and final, leaving him adrift in a sea of despair. He had blamed himself, blamed the world, blamed fate, and in his rage and sorrow he had retreated, built these walls, brick by solitary brick, ensuring no one could ever again pierce the fortress of his heart. He felt the phantom weight of her small hand in his, felt the ghost of her warmth against his side. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He had lost his own child, and now this child, broken and abandoned, had appeared on his doorstep, a living, breathing echo of his deepest wound. He forced his eyes open, tearing himself from the suffocating grip of the past, to focus on the girl, now finished with her meal, wiping her mouth delicately with the back of her hand. Her gaze, still direct, held a question he dared not answer, a silent inquiry into the depths of his own unspoken agony. He remained silent, allowing the quiet hum of the old house to fill the void, the tension in the room thick and palpable, a heavy cloak draped between them. The girl, seeing the unyielding set of his jaw, the rigid posture of his shoulders, seemed to understand that further conversation was unwelcome. She remained silent, a small, still presence in the vastness of the kitchen, her eyes observing him with a profound stillness. She possessed an uncanny ability to read the unspoken, to navigate the turbulent currents beneath the surface of his gruff exterior. Perhaps it was the burden of her own existence, a life lived on the fringes, constantly attuned to the subtle shifts in human temperament. Elias, despite his efforts to remain detached, found himself subtly aware of her. He noticed the way she gently rubbed her twisted leg, a gesture of unconscious pain, or perhaps just a habit. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, not from cold, but from exhaustion, from the sheer physical effort of surviving. The silence stretched, a thick, uncomfortable blanket woven with unspoken questions and unresolved grief. He knew he could not simply send her back out into the night. The temperature was dropping, a harsh chill creeping in through the poorly insulated walls, promising a bitter frost before dawn. His conscience, a dormant beast he thought he had long since slain, stirred uncomfortably. He considered the dangers, the coyotes that roamed the desolate stretches of land, the treacherous ravines, the sheer unforgiving expanse of the wilderness that had claimed many a lost soul. The image of her small, frail body succumbing to the elements flickered unbidden in his mind, and an unfamiliar dread, cold and sharp, pierced through his carefully constructed indifference. He still didn't want her here. He didn't want anyone here. His solitude was his armor, his fortress. Yet to abandon her would be to condemn her, and that was a burden he instinctively knew he could not bear, not now, not after the ghost of his daughter's face had so recently materialized before him. "There's a cot in the old storage shed," he rasped, his voice rougher than he intended, cutting through the silence like a rusty blade. He didn't look at her, instead focusing on the swirling patterns of dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through the window. "It's not warm, but it's shelter." The words were an offering, reluctant and grudging, but an offering nonetheless. It was the furthest extension of his generosity, a crack in the formidable wall he had built around himself. He expected a reaction, perhaps a flicker of relief, a hesitant thank you. Instead, she merely nodded, a small, solemn movement. Her acceptance was as silent and profound as her hunger, devoid of effusiveness, carrying a heavy weight of understanding. She knew this was not an act of kindness, but a compromise, a grudging truce between two lost souls. She pushed herself up slowly, using her crutch, her movements stiff but determined. The sight of her struggling, her small body trembling with effort, pricked at him. He stood rooted to the spot, torn between the impulse to help and the deep-seated fear of any further emotional entanglement. He watched her limp out of the kitchen, her silhouette fading into the deepening twilight, a small, persistent shadow against the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence she left behind was no longer empty, but filled with the resonant echoes of her presence, a disquieting hum that vibrated through the old house. The next morning dawned with a raw, unforgiving cold, the air so sharp it stung the lungs. Elias, after a night of restless, haunted sleep, found himself drawn, almost against his will, to the storage shed. He told himself it was merely to ensure she was gone, to reclaim the solitude she had briefly fractured. But as he approached, a faint wisp of smoke curling from the makeshift chimney he'd installed years ago for occasional repairs, a different kind of curiosity, cold and unsettling, stirred within him. He pushed open the creaking door, revealing the girl hunched over a tiny, smoldering fire in a rusted barrel. Her hands, red and chapped, were clasped around a chipped enamel mug, steam rising lazily into the frigid air. She looked up, her eyes holding the same unwavering directness, devoid of fear or servility. "I found some kindling," she said, her voice quiet, almost an apology for her presence. Elias merely grunted, his gaze sweeping the shed, taking in the sparse makeshift arrangement. He saw the cot neatly made with a threadbare blanket and a small worn satchel tucked neatly beside it, her only possessions. This was not the chaotic debris of a transient, but the meticulous order of someone who understood the preciousness of every single item. He remembered the scavengers, the opportunists, who had sometimes trespassed on his land, their eyes always alight with greed, their hands always ready to take. This girl was different. She had taken only what he offered, and now she had made the cold, dusty shed into a semblance of a home, a quiet act of defiance against the harshness of her circumstances. He found himself inexplicably drawn to a faded photograph tucked into the satchel, its edges curled with age. It depicted a young woman, her face gentle, almost ethereal, holding a baby. The woman's eyes, even in the faded image, held a striking resemblance to the girl's. He felt a jolt, a sudden, disorienting rush of recognition, as if he were staring into a distorted mirror of his own past. A flashback, unbidden and painful, slammed into him. He saw a young woman, his wife, her face alight with a fierce, protective love, cradling their own daughter. He remembered the softness of their baby's skin, the intoxicating scent of her hair, the simple, overwhelming joy of their small family. Then, the swift, brutal snatching away of that happiness, leaving a void that echoed with the bitterness of blame. He had blamed the doctors, the town, the very air they breathed, for failing to save his precious child. But beneath it all, gnawing at him, was the self-recrimination, the corrosive belief that he, somehow, had failed them both. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. This girl, with her quiet resilience, was a constant, living reminder of what he had lost, of the life he had once hoped for, a life that had crumbled into dust. He looked at her again, truly looked at her, seeing beyond the tattered clothes and the physical handicap. He saw a depth, a quiet strength, an undeniable echo of his own profound sorrow. He turned abruptly, walking back out into the biting wind, leaving the shed door ajar, a silent invitation, a reluctant acknowledgement of her continued presence, a gesture born not of compassion, but of a deeper, unsettling sense of shared grief he was only beginning to recognize. Days bled into weeks, each marked by the steady rhythm of the ranch and the quiet, almost imperceptible shifts in the dynamic between Elias and the girl. She had no name, or at least she never offered one, and he never asked. She became simply the girl, a spectral presence in his periphery, a testament to an unspoken truce. She spent her days exploring the edges of his vast land, her crutch a rhythmic counterpoint to the wind's endless sigh. She gathered dry wood, tended her small fire in the shed, and sometimes he would find her sitting on a weathered log, staring out at the expansive horizon, her gaze holding a profound, distant sorrow that mirrored his own. Elias, for his part, found himself adjusting his routine almost unconsciously. He left extra food on the kitchen table, sometimes a fresh apple or a piece of his sparse meat. He noticed the woodpile outside her shed growing steadily, neatly stacked. He saw the faint, wispy tracks of her crutch in the dusting of snow that now occasionally covered the ground, a testament to her quiet industry. Their interactions remained sparse, punctuated by grunts from him and soft, almost inaudible responses from her. Yet in the silence, a fragile understanding began to bloom, like a hardy desert flower pushing through cracked earth. It was not friendship, not yet, but a silent acknowledgement of shared vulnerability, two lost souls adrift in a vast, indifferent world. He still clung to his solitude, guarding it fiercely, but the edges of his isolation were beginning to soften, like ice thawing under a relentless, persistent sun. One blustery afternoon, as Elias was mending a fence line, his movements stiff from the cold, he spotted a distant plume of dust on the old dirt road. A rare occurrence. It was a battered, rusted pickup truck, kicking up gravel as it approached, an unsettling intrusion into the quiet sanctity of his land. He straightened, his hand instinctively going to the heavy axe head protruding from the fence post, his body tensing, reverting to the wary, protective stance of a lone wolf. The truck pulled up to the gate, rattling to a halt. Two men emerged, burly and unkempt, their faces hardened by years of itinerant work and perhaps something darker. They were the kind of men who rarely ventured so far off the main road, unless they were looking for trouble or something to steal. "Thorn?" one of them barked, his voice coarse, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with a predatory glint. "Heard you got some extra hands now." His gaze fell on the girl, who had emerged from the shed, drawn by the unusual sound, standing quietly in the shadows, her crutch supporting her frail frame. A sneer twisted the man's lips. "Looks like you've taken in a charity case, old man. A useless one at that." The words, loaded with a cruel dismissiveness, struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. A cold, unfamiliar fury, sharp and sudden, ignited within him. For years he had been indifferent to the judgments of the outside world, but this was different. This wasn't just an insult. It was a threat, directed at something fragile he had, however grudgingly, begun to protect. He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing, the old dormant beast within him stirring, ready to defend his territory. The words, sharp and dismissive, hung in the frigid air, a violation of the fragile peace Elias had allowed to settle over his ranch. The sneer on the man's face, the cruel assessment of the girl, ignited a cold, ancient fury within Elias. For decades he had cultivated indifference, a thick hide against the slings and arrows of the world. But this was different. This wasn't about him. It was about the small, quiet figure who had, against all his expectations, begun to thaw the ice around his heart. The girl, in her quiet way, had become an anchor, a living echo of the vulnerability he had tried so hard to deny existed within himself. He had long believed that the only way to protect himself from pain was to feel nothing, to care for no one. But the sight of this girl, judged and dismissed so brutally, triggered a protective instinct he thought had long since withered and died with his past. He stepped forward, his posture rigid, his hands clenching into fists, the sinews in his forearms standing out like ropes. The two men, sensing the shift in his demeanor, the sudden palpable danger radiating from the grizzled rancher, exchanged uneasy glances. "She's got nothing to do with you," Elias growled, his voice low and guttural, a sound that carried the weight of years of unspoken rage. "Get off my land," the second man, younger and more impulsive, scoffed. "Just a curious look, old man. No need to get your britches in a twist. We just heard you might be in the market for some help. Tough times, eh?" His gaze lingered on the girl, a predatory glint in his eyes that made Elias's blood run cold. This was not about work. It was about exploitation, about preying on the weak, about finding an easy mark. He had seen their kind before, drifting through the desolate landscapes, leaving wreckage in their wake. A sudden, vivid flashback consumed Elias. The fleeting image of his wife, her face pale and drawn, clutching their daughter, her eyes wide with fear as a group of men, desperate and hungry, had once tried to force their way onto their property during a desperate winter, claiming they had a right to shelter. He had faced them down then, a younger, stronger man, but the memory of the terror in his wife's eyes, the fragility of their small world threatened, still burned. He had protected them that day, but ultimately he had failed. The thought fueled his resolve, hardening his gaze to flint. "There's no work here for you," Elias stated, his voice devoid of negotiation, a finality that brooked no argument. "Now turn that piece of junk around and drive." He took another step forward, his presence filling the space between the men and the girl, a silent, formidable barrier. The older of the two men, seeing the unwavering resolve in Elias's eyes, the dangerous glint that suggested a man who had nothing left to lose, knew better than to push. He nodded to his companion, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. "Fine, old man. No need for trouble." They climbed back into their rusted truck, the engine sputtering to life with a cough of black smoke. As they slowly turned, leaving twin tracks in the dirt, the younger man mouthed a silent threat, a chilling promise of return. Elias watched them go, his body still rigid with tension, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He stood there until their dust cloud had vanished into the distant horizon, leaving only the vast, indifferent silence of his land. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the ranch, then settling on the girl who had remained silent throughout the encounter, her eyes fixed on him, a silent observer of his struggle. He saw the profound understanding in her gaze, a recognition of the fierce, protective act he had just performed. For the first time in decades, Elias felt something akin to purpose, a heavy, unfamiliar mantle settling on his shoulders. He was not just protecting his land, he was protecting her. The incident with the trespassers, though brief, left a lingering residue of unease in the air, a tension that settled over the ranch like an unwelcome shroud. Elias, though outwardly unperturbed, felt the gnawing sensation of vulnerability, a stark reminder that his isolated sanctuary was not entirely impervious to the outside world. He found himself more vigilant, his senses heightened, constantly scanning the horizon, listening for the telltale rumble of an approaching vehicle. He spoke more often to the girl, his words still sparse but laced with an unspoken urgency. Questions about where she came from, if she had anyone, anything. She responded with equally measured answers, fragments of a shattered life, of a mother lost to an unforgiving illness, of a brutal journey on foot after their small, makeshift home had been swept away by floodwaters. She spoke of the kind lady who had given her the crutch, a woman from a forgotten town far to the east, and of the many cold nights spent under the vast, indifferent sky. Her story, delivered without self-pity, was a testament to unimaginable hardship, a stark canvas painted with the raw truth of survival against impossible odds. Elias listened, his own past echoing in her narrative, the familiar refrain of loss, of being cast adrift. He saw his daughter's pale face in the description of her mother's illness, felt the chill of abandonment in her desolate journey. He realized, with a startling clarity that both wounded and enlightened him, that his own suffering, though deeply personal, was not unique. This girl was a living embodiment of the world's indifference, a world that had taken so much from him too. He felt a profound shift within him, a softening of the edges of his hardened heart. The instinct to protect her intensified, transforming from a reluctant duty into something akin to a fierce, almost desperate necessity. The vulnerability he had seen in her, a mirrored reflection of his own buried pain, forged a silent, unbreakable bond between them. One evening, as the first flakes of a heavy snowstorm began to fall, swirling down from a bruised, leaden sky, Elias heard a frantic whimper from the direction of the shed. He rushed out, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar dread, only to find the girl doubled over, clutching her twisted leg, her small face contorted in agony. A sharp, grating cough tore from her throat, raw and painful. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, and her skin, when he hesitantly touched her forehead, was burning with fever. The sheer vulnerability of her small body, racked by illness and pain, shocked him to his core. He had seen his own daughter succumb to a similar fever, powerless to stop the encroaching darkness. The memory was a visceral punch to the gut, raw and immediate. He felt the cold dread creep up his spine, a suffocating fear that history was about to repeat itself, that he would once again be forced to witness a child, innocent and helpless, slip away. A sudden, overwhelming panic seized him, a desperate, frantic terror that transcended his usual stoicism. This was not just a charity case. This was a living, breathing soul he had inadvertently, unwillingly, allowed to twine around the last brittle strands of his heart. The storm raged around them, a furious whiteout, as he scooped her up, her light weight shocking him, and carried her back towards the warmth of the farmhouse. The heavy flakes fell like a thick curtain, blurring the world, isolating them even further, and Elias knew with a chilling certainty that they were entirely alone, utterly dependent on his strength, his will, and his long-dormant capacity for care. He laid her gently on the old, worn sofa by the fireplace, the place he usually reserved for his own solitary reflections, now transformed into a makeshift sickbed. Her breath hitched, ragged and shallow, each gasp a jagged tear in the quiet of the farmhouse. The heat from the fire, usually a source of comfort, felt inadequate against the bone-deep chill that seemed to emanate from her small body, despite her feverish skin. He rummaged through old medicine cabinets, finding only dusty, expired remedies for common ailments, useless against the grip of this relentless fever. Panic, sharp and cold, gnawed at him. He remembered his wife's desperate pleas, the frantic calls to a doctor who lived too far away, whose horse had succumbed to the deep snow, leaving them isolated, helpless. He remembered the desperate, futile measures they had taken, the cold compresses, the whispered prayers, the crushing weight of their inadequacy as their daughter's breath grew fainter, her small hand growing colder in his. The memory was a fresh wound, bleeding raw and vivid into the present moment. He knelt beside the sofa, his large, calloused hand hovering over her forehead, his eyes, usually so guarded, now wide with a profound, terrifying vulnerability. The girl whimpered, her eyes fluttering open, clouded with pain and disorientation. Her small hand, fragile as a bird's wing, reached out, blindly searching for comfort, and instinctively, Elias took it, his rough fingers closing gently around hers. The warmth of her feverish skin, though alarming, was also a connection, a desperate thread binding them in the swirling chaos of the storm. He saw his own daughter's face superimposed over hers, the same innocent trust, the same silent plea for life. He could not, would not lose another. He was done with helplessness. He was done with letting fate dictate the terms of his existence. "You'll be all right," he rasped, the words a fierce, desperate vow, not just to her but to himself, to the ghosts of his past. He began to gather every spare blanket, every old coat, piling them onto her, trying to combat the deep chill that racked her small frame. He stoked the fire, feeding it with a furious urgency until the flames roared, casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating his grim determination. The wind howled outside, a mournful cry that seemed to echo the desperate battle being waged within the confines of the old farmhouse. He sat beside her, through the long, agonizing night, his hand never leaving hers, listening to her ragged breathing, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest. Every minute felt like an hour, every hour an eternity. He spoke to her softly, his voice a low rumble, telling her about the ranch, about the seasons, about anything that came to mind, a desperate attempt to anchor her to life, to chase away the encroaching shadows. He remembered the stories he used to tell his own daughter, tales of brave cowboys and talking animals, whispered into the quiet darkness of her nursery. The irony was a bitter, poignant taste in his mouth. He had walled himself off from the world, believing it was the only way to escape pain, only to find himself confronting the deepest agony of his past, resurrected in the fragile form of a stranger. The darkness outside mirrored the turmoil within him, a crucible of fear and hope, of love and loss. As the first slivers of dawn painted the eastern sky in bruised purples and pale oranges, the fever finally, blessedly, broke. The girl's breathing softened, deepening into a more regular rhythm. The clammy heat receded from her skin, replaced by a more natural warmth. Elias hunched over the sofa, his body stiff with exhaustion and relief, felt the tremor of her hand in his, a delicate squeeze, an almost imperceptible signal that she had weathered the storm. He watched her sleep, truly sleep for the first time since she had arrived, her small face peaceful, devoid of the weariness and pain that usually etched its lines. A profound exhaustion settled over him, not just physical, but an emotional fatigue that went soul deep, yet it was laced with an unfamiliar sense of profound, quiet gratitude. He had faced his deepest fear, wrestled with the ghost of his past, and this time, he had not been powerless. This time he had clung to hope and she had clung to life. The silence in the farmhouse was no longer heavy with dread, but imbued with the fragile promise of a new day. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttering open, they held a clarity he hadn't seen before, a spark of resilient life that had momentarily been extinguished. She looked at him, her gaze direct, unwavering, and a faint, hesitant smile touched her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still weak but clear, carrying the weight of unburdened gratitude. The words, so simple, yet so profound, resonated deep within him, echoing through the empty chambers of his heart, filling them with an unfamiliar warmth. He felt a sting behind his eyes, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades, a loosening of the tight knot of grief that had constricted his soul for so long. The rigid walls he had built around himself, piece by agonizing piece, had finally crumbled, not in a catastrophic collapse, but in a quiet, almost imperceptible surrender to the tide of human connection. He realized, with a startling clarity, that the irony of his life was profound. He had sought isolation to escape the pain of loss, but it was in the crucible of this fragile new connection that he had found a path, however faint, back to himself. The girl, in her quiet, persistent way, had not only asked for his leftovers but had inadvertently demanded he confront the leftovers of his own shattered life, the fragments of hope and humanity he had long abandoned. He had offered her shelter, food, and in return she had offered him a mirror, a chance to finally see the depths of his own unspoken sorrow and the nascent capacity for love that still lay dormant beneath the layers of his hardened exterior. The sun began to climb higher, casting long, pale shadows through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, transforming the cold, stark kitchen into a space infused with a fragile, hesitant warmth. The ranch, stretching endlessly outside, no longer seemed a desolate monument to his isolation, but a vast, silent canvas upon which a new, uncertain chapter was beginning to be written. He still did not know her name, nor did she know his full story, but in the quiet, shared space of that morning, a bond had formed, forged in the crucible of fear and hope, a silent testament to the enduring power of human connection, even in the most desolate of places. Days then folded into weeks, and weeks into the gradual thawing of winter's icy grip. The girl, now stronger, moved with a newfound, if still cautious energy. Her presence in the old farmhouse became less of an intrusion and more of a quiet fixture, like the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Elias found himself speaking more, not in long monologues but in observations, questions about the changing weather, the needs of the land. He taught her how to mend small tears in fabric, how to prepare simple meals, how to tend the fire. She absorbed it all, a silent, attentive student, her eyes mirroring his every move, her quiet understanding a balm to his long-silenced soul. He learned of her small joys, the way her eyes lit up at the sight of a robin, the quiet hum she made as she sketched crude but heartfelt drawings of the ranch animals on scraps of paper she found. He saw the resilience that truly defined her, a strength that transcended her physical disability. He realized that her request for leftovers had been a profound act of courage, not of weakness. She had not asked for charity, but for a chance, a sliver of possibility in a world that had offered her none. The ranch, once a sanctuary from the world, began to feel less like a prison and more like a home. The silence once stifling now held the comfortable murmur of two lives slowly intertwining. Elias, for the first time in decades, felt the tentative stirrings of purpose that extended beyond his own survival. He saw a flicker of the future, Not just an endless, desolate horizon, but a landscape touched by the possibility of shared moments, of quiet companionship. The memories of his past, though still painful, no longer held him entirely captive. They were still there, like old scars, but they no longer bled with the same raw intensity. The girl, in her innocent presence, had become a bridge, connecting him to a lost part of himself, to the capacity for tenderness and protection he thought he had extinguished long ago. One crisp morning, as the first green shoots of spring pushed through the thawed earth, she approached him as he was sharpening an old axe. Her gaze, serious and direct, held a new resolve. "My name is Ilara," she said, her voice clear, a quiet declaration. It was the first time she had offered her name, a profound act of trust, a quiet claiming of her place. Elias looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not just the fragile girl he had reluctantly taken in, but a resilient young woman who had, in her quiet way, cracked open the hardened shell of his existence. He saw a future, not free of struggle or pain, but one shared, one imbued with the quiet hope that bloomed from the desolate landscape of his past. The ranch stretched out around them, vast and indifferent, yet somehow transformed, no longer merely a place of exile, but a space where life, against all odds, was beginning to bloom again. The silence was not empty, but filled with the resonant hum of two souls, finding unexpected solace in each other's quiet presence. Elias, for the first time in a very long time, felt a profound, gentle peace settle over him, a sense of having come home, not to a place, but to a life he thought he had lost forever. The seasons turned, as they always do, relentless in their cyclical embrace of life and decay, yet for Elias Thorne, the turning held a new significance. The vibrant greens of spring, the sun-baked dust of summer, the fiery golds of autumn, and the stark hushed whites of winter now carried the gentle rhythm of Ilara's quiet presence. The ranch, once a solitary bastion, transformed into a shared space, infused with the subtle hum of two lives intertwined. Elias found himself watching her more often, not with the initial wary scrutiny, but with a quiet, almost reverent observation. He saw the subtle improvements in her walk, the increasing strength in her arms from carrying wood, the way her eyes, once shadowed with deep-seated weariness, now held a clearer, more open light. She had discovered a latent talent for carving small, intricate figures from discarded wood, animals and abstract shapes that spoke of an inner world both delicate and profound. These small creations left on his workbench or by his plate were silent gifts, testaments to her quiet joy, to the life she was slowly reclaiming. He, in turn, found his voice, not just in practical commands, but in sharing the stories of the ranch, tales of past winters, of the animals he had known, of the land that had shaped him. He spoke of his parents, of their struggle to build this life, revealing fragments of a past he had kept buried for decades. He found solace in the telling, in the quiet, attentive way she listened, her gaze never wavering, offering not judgment, but understanding. There was a quiet strength in her silence, a depth that invited him to delve deeper into his own scarred landscape. He saw the world through her eyes, a world of small wonders, the intricate pattern of a spiderweb dusted with dew, the sudden burst of a wild rose in an unexpected place, the defiant tenacity of a lone hawk circling against the vast sky. These were things he had long ceased to notice, lost in the inward spiral of his grief. She brought them back to him, not with words, but with the quiet intensity of her gaze, the gentle pointing of a finger, the soft intake of her breath. He learned that the weight of his loneliness had been far heavier than the burden of responsibility he had initially feared. The ironic twist of fate was profound. He had sought refuge from pain in isolation, only to find that true healing began when he allowed another soul to breach his carefully constructed walls. He still did not speak of his daughter directly, the wound still too raw, too sacred to share fully, but the constant quiet presence of Ilara, her resilience and her burgeoning spirit, slowly, irrevocably, began to mend the deepest fissures in his heart. The ranch continued its timeless cycle, but the silence within it was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft thud of a crutch on the earth, the quiet murmur of two voices, and the unspoken language of shared existence, a testament to the unexpected paths through which hope, like a tenacious seed, can finally break through the hardest ground.